Hey everybody, today I want to talk about something that honestly I've been thinking a lot about lately. I have noticed in my life I'm often plagued by guilt. It's something I honestly struggle, admittedly, way too much with. I often notice I blame myself for things that really aren't totally my fault or that don't even necessarily matter that much. I spend time going over things I could have done differently, how I could be better. And while I do think that intentional self-improvement and acknowledging when we do something wrong is an important part of being human and in growing, I also think that sometimes we can take it too far and that it can be really destructive in our lives and keep us from living up to our full potential. I am somebody that historically has gotten so much feedback from mentors and supervisors that I apologize too much. I know that's such a cliche for women these days, but it's something I've genuinely struggled with. And I would say that even for women, I'm on the end of the spectrum, or at least in the past, I've been on the end where I just apologize way too much. And the thing is, I feel like to other people, it would end up coming across as disingenuous, like I was just apologizing because I felt like it would make the situation better, but that I didn't really mean it. But quite often I genuinely meant it. And it was about even little things that would bother me for hours or even days later. I genuinely felt sorry for all these tiny little things that ultimately often weren't totally my fault, or were things that other people didn't really notice much. Or maybe they did, but it probably wasn't worth my time to spend so much effort worrying about it. Now, I will admit I've worked a lot on this. I don't apologize as much as I used to, and I do think overall my confidence has grown. But somehow that guilt piece, the feeling of what could I have done better? I didn't do this right. Or that anticipatory guilt where I'm like, ugh, this is coming up. I gotta get this done. I gotta do this right. I gotta think about how I'm acting in relation to other people and that I'm not hurting anyone's feelings. It just gets to be a lot. And sometimes it's even like when I do something decently, I wish I could have done it better. And so I was just doing some reading on guilt in general, and I came across this concept of the guilt gap, which is basically the idea that women tend to experience guilt more intensely or more frequently than men do. And I just thought, wow, I should really talk about this on my channel because I do feel like minimalism and building an empowering mindset has to do with our emotions and the way we navigate this world. And I think that guilt is a part of that. Guilt plays a huge role in decluttering, and it also plays a huge role in just feeling confident and going about the world in a positive way. And I also know through analytics that the vast majority of my viewers are women. And so why not kind of directly address this women's issue? That being said, I don't want to exclude people who are men. And in fact, I would argue that men should hear about this as well and relate it to their own lives. In addition, if you don't follow a gender binary, there's still something to be gleaned here. I'm just basing this off of the research that tended to look at things in a male-female way, although I definitely think there are problems with that and that we should be more inclusive. I definitely think that some of these concepts of how guilt is socialized in us could apply to groups beyond just men and women. With all that being said, I want to talk about the guilt gap.
You've got to get a hold of yourself.
Basically, there's this growing body of research that indicates that men tend to experience guilt less than women, and that the nature or quality of that guilt is inherently different, at least on average. Again, studies, they're across big groups of people. Individuals are different. This might not necessarily apply to you. But basically, women experience more guilt, and then even sometimes they start to feel guilty about their guilt. Dr. Jane Bybee wrote a summary of a book chapter she wrote on this topic. This is what she said. Males are more likely than females to deny culpability for their actions and are less likely to experience ongoing, unalleviated feelings of guilt. Males feel less intense guilt with development during adolescence. In contrast, females are more likely to feel guilt about inconsiderate behavior and around family members. Inconsiderateness is seen as non-normative for females, and females may be especially harsh in punishing themselves for misbehavior that runs counter to sex role stereotypes. Guilt over inconsiderate behavior becomes more prevalent with development for females. Peers hold females compared to males more accountable for their actions. Parents likewise are less tolerant of misbehavior among females than males and are more likely to use discipline techniques with daughters that lead to guilt. Females compared to males are more willing to concede responsibility for misdeeds and apparently have more difficulty expelling feelings of guilt, as evidenced by their higher scores on chronic guilt. Basically, there's a culture that socializes women to feel more guilty than men, and especially in the area of being considerate towards others, thinking about other people's feelings, seeing how they're doing. There's that expectation for women to be really good at sensing how other people are feeling and coping with it and being thoughtful about it. And women in youth and adolescence are even punished more than men for not being overly considerate. I also think it's interesting that women are way more likely to acknowledge their culpability than men are. Men are less likely to actually acknowledge what role they played in the problem. And in some ways, I actually think there's some self-awareness to this, that I don't mean to just put women down, that women should feel less guilt. Like, in some ways, I think that's actually a really amazing quality that women tend to have a little bit more of than men, again, on average. And so I do think that in some ways, we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves, because probably that consideration towards others and that acknowledgement of how we contribute to problems in situations is really healthy. And I kind of wish men were a little bit more that way on average, honestly. Like, it shouldn't just be that women should become more like men, that's for sure. But I also think that sometimes we can get into the spiral of blaming ourselves to a point where it is detrimental and it is hurting us. I think it's important to acknowledge when we do something wrong, but then it can go too far, especially when it's about really little things, like forgetting to do a really tiny task at work that didn't matter if it happened today or tomorrow, but I said I'd do it today and then I kind of forget or something. I think we can get all wound up in these specific examples of being imperfect, of not being hyper considerate of others, and it can just be this downward spiral until we just become way too overwhelmed. But I think there's power in knowing that there's research that actually supports the idea that women are socialized to be this way. Men are socialized to not feel as guilty, to not take as much credit for bad things that happen. And to me, it made me feel a little bit better, because it's not like it's totally my fault. I do think that at times when past supervisors or mentors have told me to apologize less, I felt kind of unseen or misunderstood. And somehow knowing this made me understand a little bit better that it's not like something was majorly wrong with me. In fact, I was following the script that I was told to follow as a kid. And coming from the Midwest and having spent a lot of time on the East Coast, I think that was especially true, that I seemed extra apologetic, perhaps because of my more immediate socialization even here. And I think maybe even at times that rubbed people the wrong way. But I do really value an honest apology. I do really value acknowledging when you screw things up, because that way you can grow, that way you can learn. But I do think sometimes it's important to be aware of when it can get in our way, and that there are ways to acknowledge our role in something without being hyper apologetic or kind of mentally beating ourselves up. I think if you're noticing that you're ruminating on a particular topic for too long, maybe it's time to just refocus your attention and remind yourself about the guilt gap, and that you don't necessarily need to be constantly thinking about this, because ultimately it's something that society kind of put on you if you're a woman experiencing this. I also read one study that talked about how women experience guilt as more of like shame than guilt. That's one way to look at it too. Just notice if you're starting to get to a place where it's getting to the level of shame, and whether it's getting to a point where you're just like feeling really bad about yourself, and maybe check it, because maybe you don't have to feel quite so bad. Overall, the problem too is that when women feel so much guilt, I think it's harder to put yourself forward, to kind of be gloat-y and to show off and to put yourselves for promotions or just self-promote in general, because we tend to spend so much time feeling guilty, and I think that can be a really big problem. I also think part of the point of this is like, just don't blame yourself for the guilt. If you experience the guilt, if you apologize a lot, so be it. I mean, maybe you can apologize less, and that's great, but maybe we should also just acknowledge that the system is the problem, the socialization is the problem, and maybe we can be a little bit more aware of it even in our coworkers or people that we work with in our community. How do we treat them? What expectations do we have for women instead of men? And how can we relieve other women around us of this guilt? That's something I'm really trying to be aware of, is really reassuring women when they're feeling guilty about something, why they're not to blame, or just having open conversations about things like the guilt gap. I think it's possible to shift society. I think it's possible to get men to be perhaps even a little bit more considerate. and to help women not feel quite so much shame. I guess the moral of this video that I'm trying to say is we should just all start talking about this issue more. We should all be aware of how we might play into the guilt gap and somehow make women feel more guilty and men less guilty. How can we take the whole situation by the reins and do something about it? I think it really comes down to even conversations with our friends and our family and how we interact with each other. That's where we can make the difference. Anyway, I know this video was a little bit different than a lot of my videos. Let me know in the comments what you think about this concept of the guilt gap. What's your take on it? Have you experienced it in your life? And what do you think we should do about it? If you ended up enjoying the video, hit the thumbs up button. You can subscribe below. Doing both those things really supports the channel, so if you're willing to do it, I'd appreciate it. And then also, I have my new Instagram linked below, as well as my Patreon community where you can get more content directly from me on minimalism, on building an empowering mindset, and it's also a great way to support the channel. I guess that's all I've got for you today, but thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
You've got to get a hold of yourself.